let's talk about the Mount Rushmore for running backs and receivers. Uh, but first, we're gonna start off with running backs, and and the first name you have to mention from the top. You have to mention Kevin Faulk. Kevin Faulk is by far the most important player of the modern era. You have to. Kevin Faulk, at the time when he was getting recruited to LSU, a lot of people left the state. And I don't blame them. LSU wasn't very good, but also LSU had a tough time trying to get guys to stay in the state of Louisiana. And Kevin Faulk was really the first big time recruit out of the state of Louisiana in the modern era to commit to LSU. And stayed with that commitment. And then it worked out. Kevin Faulk was a 3-time first team All SEC running back, a 2-time All American. He is LSU's all-time leading rusher with 4,557 yards. When he left LSU, he was second behind Herschel Walker in SEC history in rushing yards, and he also finished his career with 6,833 all-purpose yards and 53 total touchdowns. That was tied for 5th in SEC history, and also first in SEC history. And of course, that has since been broken by Tim Tebow. That's first. I think he is the most impactful running back one of the most important players in modern LSU history. You have to include him just because of what he meant to LSU. And it's not even just football, but the history of athletics in LSU, because he was, to me, the first dominant. And I know that, of course, he was in the Jerry Donardo era, right? But if you look at the first 3 years he was there at LSU, they had 2 10-win seasons. That had not happened in since the 70s. He was a very, very impactful player, and there's a lot of people in Louisiana, or LSU fans, people that covered LSU, will all say the same thing. He's arguably the most important player in LSU history because he made it cool for kids from Louisiana to come to LSU. And of course, Nick Saban came to LSU, and he was able to get a whole lot more of Kevin Faulk's. But Kevin Faulk had to be the first domino that had to fall for LSU if you wanted to keep those guys here in the state of Louisiana. The next guy on the Mount Rushmore is none other than Leonard Fornette, number 7 himself. Leonard Fornette is by far the most talented running back to ever come to LSU since Kevin Faulk. Leonard Fornette, 2-time All-SEC, a 2015 consensus All-American running back. He even started as a true freshman. He didn't become the starter at first, but as the season went on, he became the starter. Played in all 13 games with 6 starts. Had 187 carries, 1,034 yards, and 10 touchdowns. He had 7 catches for 127 yards. And he also had a kickoff return for a touchdown in the Music City Bowl against Notre Dame. Who, by the way, the head coach of Notre Dame at the time was Brian Kelly. And that was his first year. He ran for 1,000 yards. But in 2015, that was his breakout year. 300 carries for 1,953 yards and 22 touchdowns. And he averaged 163 yards per game. Those were all SEC highs. I believe 163 yards per game was the most in SEC history in yards per game, if I remember correctly. He also had 19 catches for 253 yards and a touchdown. I mean, just an absolute beast. And by the way, 1,553 yards is an LSU single season rushing record. And in 2016, in a short, so he only played in 7 games due to injuries. But he had 129 carries for 843 yards and 8 touchdowns. And he also had 15 catches for 146 yards. And really, to be honest with you, if Leonard Fornette didn't have his injuries his senior season, he might have finished as LSU's all-time rushing yards holder. I mean, there's a great possibility that could happen. Just because I think he finished with just under 4,000 yards, and the record is, of course, I just mentioned it, 4,557. There's a great chance that if he ran, he could have had a chance to break that record. There was a great chance, but Leonard Fournette arguably is the he's the most talented running back that's played at LSU since Kevin Faulk. Now let's get into, I guess you could say, the old days, and that is, and you have to go talk about Charles Alexander. Charles Alexander is one of the greatest running backs in LSU history. As a matter of fact, his number will be retired during the Florida game on September 13th later this year. Of course, third game of the season, which also is a very, very important game. Charles Alexander, one of the greatest running backs, not only in LSU history, but in the history of the SEC. He rushed for over 4,035 yards and scored 40 rushing touchdowns in his career. And by the way, he was the first running back in SEC history to rush for 4,000 yards in a career. He ran for 686 yards and he also rushed for 153.3 yards per game in 1977, which was his best year at LSU. Those were single season records that stood at LSU for nearly 40 years until Leonard Fournette broke it. He was the SEC Player of the Year, and he was also a 2-time Heisman finalist. He was arguably the best player in LSU history in the 70s. I mean, one of the greatest running backs in LSU history. He's definitely you can make a case a top 10 player in LSU history. You really could. Just based off his impact on this LSU team in the 70s. Just a great running back. One of the greatest to ever do it in the purple and gold. And it's great that he will get his number retired. By the way, he's one of 2 players to get his number. Well, one of 4 players to get his number retired at LSU. Just one of 4, and that will happen on September 12th, September 13th later this year when LSU will square off against Florida. And I mentioned retired numbers. There's another one of those 4 players that got his number retired, and he's going to be in the Mount Rushmore. And you have to mention Billy Cannon, the first megastar in LSU's illustrious football history. Billy Cannon, yeah, like I said, he is the first superstar in LSU history. 2-time SEC Player of the Year, and a unanimous All-American in 1959. 3-time All-SEC Player, was a 1959 Heisman Trophy winner, and then also was the first one, as I mentioned, in the history of LSU to win the Heisman Trophy. But what makes Billy Cannon so iconic? Because there isn't a whole lot of film on Billy Cannon, right? I mean, he played in the late 50s. There's just this, and none of us saw him play. That's a lot of people who were watching this did not see him play in person. But what makes Billy Cannon so iconic was his punt return for a touchdown that ended up being the game-winning touchdown against Ole Miss on October 31st, Halloween night in 1959, and arguably the biggest game in LSU's season that year against Ole Miss. Billy Cannon returned the punt 89 yards for a touchdown on Halloween night. And you can make a case is the greatest punt return not only in LSU history or in SEC history, but the history of college football. I mean, this was his Heisman moment. When you think of Heisman moments, there are, if you go back to the old days, there's not really many plays you can say, oh, that was his Heisman moment. That was really the first Heisman moment of Heisman moments. I mean, it really was. I mean, that game single-handedly won the Heisman. And matter of fact, if you look at Billy Cannon's stats, the year he won the Heisman wasn't even his best year. That actually could have been his worst year. Right? He had 598 yards of rushing. The previous 2 years he had 583 in 1957, and in 1958 he had 686. But both those years he averaged about 5.8 yards per carry. He averaged 4.3 yards per carry in 1959 and had 598 yards of rushing, and also it was the least amount of receiving yards he had. But when you make big time plays, big time moments, including that 89-yard touchdown, that lives on forever, man. And he is in the LSU running back Mount Rushmore. That is my LSU running back Mount Rushmore. Kevin Faulk, Leonard Fornette, Billy Cannon, and Charles Alexander. Some honorable mentions as well. Dalton Hilliard. Of course, he was kind of on the bubble. He was right outside. But it was hard to replace him with either Charles Alexander. It was hard to replace Charles Alexander, Billy Cannon, Leonard Fornette, and Kevin Faulk. Dalton Hilliard had a great career at LSU. Was a multiple-time All-SEC performer. And, of course, had a great career in the NFL as well, mostly with the Saints. But he just missed out. But you also got to mention Jacob Hester. You have to mention Jeremy Hill, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and unfortunately Darius Geis. And really, Darius Geis would be much higher on the list if it had not been for the off-the-field stuff. But still, just LSU has a lot of running backs throughout its history that you could make a case could be on the Mount Rushmore.